Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on a Friday evening. We're all just sitting up here talking about what a tremendous turnout this is for a Friday night. So we're really glad you're here. We're excited to have this. We're excited to have this conversation. For those of you who don't know, I'm Justin Anderson. I'm Dartmouth's Senior Vice President for Communications. Before I had this role at Dartmouth, I was a news reporter and covered politics for almost 15 years. So this is a topic that I'm keenly interested in, and I'm thrilled to have access to these four faculty members to help us sort through what we experienced earlier this week and what we should get ready to experience moving forward. And speaking of moving forward, I'm going to go down the line here and introduce the esteemed panel. Jenny Lind, to my immediate left, is an associate professor of government. She is also a faculty associate at the Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies at Harvard University. Did I get that right? Close enough. And a research associate in the program on the U.S. and the Americas at Chatham House in London. Jenny, I've known you for years, and I'm like learning stuff about you through the intro. This is amazing.
Surprises.
Professor Lind's research focuses on the international relations of East Asia and U.S. foreign policy toward the region. She is the author of a forthcoming book, Half Vicious, Smart Authoritarianism and the Rise of China, which will be published next fall by Cornell. Professor Lind regularly publishes foreign policy commentary in the magazine Foreign Affairs, as well as other popular outlets. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of a Substack newsletter called Blue Blaze about U.S. foreign policy, so check that out. To Professor Lind's left is Jason Barabas. Jason is the director of the Rockefeller Center and is a professor in the government department. Jason teaches and conducts research on American politics in the areas of political knowledge, deliberation, public policy, and quantitative methodology. Excuse me. Jason earned his PhD in political science from Northwestern and his undergraduate degree here at Dartmouth. After graduating from college, Jason was appointed as a campaign issues director and economic policy advisor for a moderate Midwestern Republican governor in Illinois. Who is that?
Jim Edgar?
Jim? Got it. Not in prison?
Not.
Okay.
Either side, but he was
Yeah, well,
respectable.
different
breed.
Different breed. In the years since, Professor Barabas has held postdoc fellowships at Harvard and Princeton, as well as in academic faculty positions in New York, Florida, and Illinois. Anna Mahoney, executive director of the Rockefeller Center and a lecturer in the government department. Anna conducts research centered on women's representation in gendered institutions. Her book, Women Take Their Place in State Legislatures, the creation of women's caucuses, and with the Temple University Press, was published in 2018. And to Anna's left, Brendan Nyhan, who is the James O. Friedman Presidential Professor in the Department of Government and co-director of Bright Line Watch, a watchdog group that monitors the status of American democracy. We're going to talk about that. Nyhan was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2023 and previously was named a Guggenheim Fellow by the Guggenheim Foundation, an Andrew Carnegie Fellow by the Carnegie Corporation, and a Belfer Fellow by the ADL. He also received the Emerging Scholar Award for the top scholar in the field within 10 years of receiving their PhD by the American Political Science Association section on elections, political opinion, and voting behavior. So we are extremely lucky to have these four folks with us. So you all will have, all of you who want will have an opportunity to ask questions, which we'll do, in about a half hour or so. But we'll start with, I'll start us off with some questions that hopefully lead to sort of a wide-ranging conversation, and then you all can jump in. Jason and I were talking as you all were filing in and saying when we scheduled this event, we thought it was certainly likely, if not, well, we certainly thought that it was likely that the vote would still be counted at this point, and that we might not know who the next president of the United States was going to be. That's not the case, despite the fact that when Senator John Fetterman was here a couple weeks ago, he called it a coin toss. All of the polls leading up to, or most of the polls leading up to Election Day, had as tight a race as we've seen at that time in the election cycle, particularly in battlegrounds. So we really were thinking that that it could take a while to sort it all out. That didn't happen. So what did? What happened? What did we see on Tuesday? Anyone want to take that one first? Brendan?
All right, I'll start us off. Hi, everyone. Well, what we saw was what political scientists call a uniform swing. So basically, a kind of relatively parallel movement in the vote margin towards Trump relative to what we saw in 2020. And that makes it hard to tell any particular story about why some group or some information source or some campaign factor drove the result, because what we're seeing instead is a kind of broad swing across geographies, across constituent groups, et cetera. The data aren't in to go much further than that on exactly what drove it. There are a lot of explanations that are being proposed that we can talk about. But I think you have to start from that premise first. That's what we're seeing is a kind of uniform movement. John Fetterman said it was a coin toss. That's where the public polls were approximately. But we know that there's something called polling error. And from election to election, the polls are off sometimes by 2 or 3 percentage points or more. The polling error was not large, but when the elections are so close as they have been, that can, of course, cause us to not accurately predict the outcome of the election. And so people were surprised that they were seeing essentially ties in the battleground states, and then the polling error looks like it was maybe 3 percentage points. Does that mean polls are broken? Not necessarily. They performed amazingly well considering how few of you take them. Shots fired at the audience, sorry. But they have struggled with not undercounting Trump support in the last 3 presidential election cycles. And that's an ongoing challenge the field is trying to figure out how to solve.
Okay.
Jason, do you want to
Sure.
do you want to add to that? I mean, in terms of polling, I mean, you in fact launched the Dartmouth poll
In New Hampshire.
Right. And so, what did you find there to be in retrospect? How do you feel you and the students and your colleagues who were involved? How do you feel that it performed, and how do you feel about the approach you took? And if you could just talk a little bit about the poll and sort of about the results that you found.
Yeah, so this was a classroom exercise, and we've been working hard. There's probably many students in the audience who are familiar with that. If you just look at the winner, we got 3 out of 4 winners, right, of the races we called. That said, our margins were, even after starting with a very clean random sample of the registered voters in the state of New Hampshire, we experienced kind of what Brendan was talking about is, not a lot of people. 2,000 people came into the first wave, but that means tens of thousands did not. And then within there, we saw a particular type of voter, a voter that was very enamored with the president, vice president, and all the rest of the Democratic candidates. So our numbers were off relative to that. We're still with the class trying to diagnose, what the source of that was, trying different weighting schemes and whatnot. That's been the fun part, is to kind of dive into all that, and really do it as a learning exercise. And it was our first effort too. So the New York Times kind of rated us as a preferred or select polling because of the random sampling, because of the other methodologies that we use to try to make sure we're talking to the person that we thought we were talking to, or I should say, in the internet, interacting with that person. But I would just echo kind of what you heard earlier, that the polls overall, nationally, not ours, but nationally, were very close. In fact, probably too close. So there are way too many polls right at that 50-50 mark, relative to what we should see. If a normal distribution would have polls more in the 46 to maybe 54, 53. So if there's something odd going on, it's perhaps that it was too close to call. There's some suggestions that that's evidence of herding, that pollsters looking at each other and trying to make sure that they're not wrong by too much. We were not overly concerned with that. So we were just trying to we kind of committed to our methodology well before we were releasing a lot of our polls. So that's one thing to think about. I think you started off with Fetterman, Senator Fetterman, talking about how it's a coin flip. And I said, well, that was 2 weeks ago, Justin. So that was October 23rd.
That's true.
We things changed, and that, in fact, some of the classic polling failures in the United States, particularly the 1948 Dewey defeats Truman debacle, they stopped polling too early. So things could have been changing, right up to the end too. And I think we saw a lot of that. But it was a pretty broad brush victory overall.
It's a sort of a cliche to say that the only poll that counts is the one that happens on election day, and so we now know, or we know largely what happened on election day as it relates to the contest for president, and so I realize that you all are still processing this, but I mean I do think that it was the outcome, though I'm sure there were some who predicted it. It was not it was a larger or easier win for President Trump than many expected. And so, Anna, I'll put you on the spot. What do we as a country make of that, of what appears to be a relatively easy win by the Republican candidate Donald Trump over the Democrat Kamala Harris? How do we begin to make sense of what that means and what it says about where the country is right now?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of concern that I have in trying to read too much into what was kind of an unusual campaign to begin with. So we have Donald Trump, who I think everyone can agree is a sort of non-traditional candidate that is not necessarily articulating really coherent policy views and is appealing in different ways that I think traditional politicians do. But on the other side, we also had the unusual situation where Joe Biden was the nominee for a long time, and then he stepped down, and the way the vice president became the candidate was atypical, and she had a shorter period of time to the ballot box. I don't know that time would have made any difference, but I do think that this was a unique election in a lot of ways, and so being able to take too much out of this, it may be, we may need to see a few more regular elections. This certainly was not that.
So it was unique in a lot of ways. In some ways, maybe it was very sort of standard and typical in as much as inflation was a big issue. I mean, I hate to oversimplify something that's incredibly complicated, but was this because of inflation?
To be fair to the American voter, I don't know how much American voters really understand economic policy and which, I mean, present company excluded, you are all geniuses. But I think that we frequently want to attribute a lot of coherent ideological policy-driven explanations that are probably not rooted in the literature.
Sure, but they do understand that stuff costs more.
Yes.
And rightly or wrongly, they will sometimes pull the lever because they're angry about stuff costing more.
That's right, and that's about different from now, not necessarily which of these two options is better for me.
Yeah.
So I think that's fair.
Brendan, you look like you maybe were going to say something about
So
that.
I'll just add briefly, you may have seen these charts going around showing the underperformance of governing parties that were in office during COVID. And the interpretation that's been offered is that, around the world, we're seeing whoever was in office and therefore held responsible for inflation, whether or not their policy choices actually caused it or not, whether or not their country performed relatively better or worse than its comparison countries or not, those governing parties have tended to underperform. The Democrats are actually at the top of the distribution in terms of the vote shift relative to other governing parties around the world. So you can, depending on how you think about this, right, the Democrats underperformed relative to 2020, but they may have overperformed relative to what we would have expected, given the way inflation hurts. And we don't have a lot of experience with this. I just want to kind of remind folks that high levels of inflation like what we experienced hadn't really been a part of American politics since the 1970s. Our data is quite limited. Most of our quantitative understandings of how people decide who to vote for are from this historic period of stable, low inflation. And so we didn't maybe understand as well as we now do how much people hate inflation. I saw a claim being made that, when the economy's bad and people are out of work, there's often a kind of, well, they need to work harder and find a job, right? But inflation just happens to you, and it happens to everybody, right? Everyone feels it, right? And there's no way in which it's specific to you or there's some kind of moral story about why it's your fault, right? It's just this thing that's happening that people feel powerless over, and they can feel it eroding their wage gains, right? And so, there are some metrics where the U.S. has done really well. There are other metrics where real household income is just getting back to where it was in 2019, right? Those are not conditions for a strong Democratic Party performance.
Yeah, interesting. Jenny, so far focusing a lot on sort of the domestic, would love to go international, at least to some extent. We were talking earlier about Ukraine and the reported conversation today that President Trump was having with Ukrainian President Zelensky, and I don't know if he phoned a friend or brought in a friend, but Elon Musk was on the call, and so I'm not asking you if you have inside information about what they discussed, but I do wonder what you think about how Donald Trump's election will affect what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah. I think that with this election, you can make there's some big question marks about who benefits and who suffers. I think there's some very clear winners and losers from this election, and I think Ukraine is very much on that list of countries that are not happy about this victory, and this is not something that they're happy about, right? So the extent that the U.S. has given significant military aid and economic aid to Ukraine, and that we now have a leader coming in who we know doesn't support that. So that's the potential here is Trump could use his influence to again, remember, Biden has been giving aid to Ukraine using the presidential directive authority, right? So it's not been Congress, it's been the president has literally been giving Ukraine aid. Would President Trump do the same? I don't think anybody believes he would. And so then Congress could still support aid to Ukraine, but we've seen, how that debate tends to go, and then we have a new Congress coming in where, again, big question mark about that. So I think obviously Russia's a sovereign state, Ukraine's a sovereign state. Those are the two combatants. So they choose when this war ends, right? And the U.S. has some influence, but those are the two states that are fighting a war. But as I said, the U.S. does influence the balance of power in that it's providing a lot of the support to Ukraine. And so if it ceases doing that will influence Ukraine's calculations about should it keep fighting this war and what terms to accept a ceasefire with Russia.
Ukraine is not a member of NATO. but NATO is something that that President Trump talked a lot about during his first time in office. There was a lot of talk about whether or not he might pull the U.S. out of NATO. How do you? Oh, thank you. How do you think about that as the second term begins? Do you think we sort of pick up where we left off, where he might be threatening to either make the other countries pay their dues quite literally, or do you think he feels like we tried it for 4 years when I was president and I don't see the value in it? So I guess I'd ask, what is the value to the U.S. being in NATO, and what do you think the Trump restoration will do to the dynamic now?
Wow, Trump restoration, that's a dramatic phrase. Wow, you heard it here first. Justin Anderson, everyone. Kind of got chills down my spine.
It's hashtag Trump.
Hashtag Trump restoration. So we know that Trump is very cranky about NATO, right? He went over there to various meetings and yelled at everybody, and they were very unhappy about that. And then it actually kind of worked to get them to increase defense spending. So he's not very polite, but he is deeply concerned about trying to get European allies to spend more on defense. And I mean, at the time, I don't remember the exact number, but maybe fewer than half of NATO members were actually meeting the floor of defense spending requirements for NATO, which the alliance has agreed is 2% of your GDP. And so again, we're talking about the floor of defense spending was not being met, let alone were they going higher. And this was in a post-Crimea world, and still in a post-Ukraine invasion world, there I can't remember the exact number, but there are many NATO allies that still don't meet that floor. So this is something that it's not just Trump is concerned about. This is, lots of people are concerned about this. It relates to NATO's ability to protect itself, and it relates to European security broadly. And I think the trend in general that we're going to be seeing going forward is Europe really is going to be forced to invest more in its own strategic autonomy. The United States is in a different world than it was, 3 decades ago when we were the Colossus and there were no other great power threats and so on. We now have a peer competitor in China, in Asia. And so, when we had that with the Soviet Union, we had to rely really heavily on allies to fight that. We didn't say, oh, don't worry, everybody, we got this, and everybody spent 1.2% on GDP on defense. That's not how you defeat a peer competitor, right? Hopefully, even if it's just through peacetime containment. So the allies have to do more in that situation. And then we have, in a Trump administration, we know there's a mix of views on this. There's still many people from the kind of more Reaganite tradition of, very bullish on NATO, very important alliance. United States should be everywhere, negotiating deals and going to war if necessary. That kind of more globalist tradition. Trump will have some of those folks within his administration. He did the first time. And so that will influence NATO policy. He'll also, however, have the faction that we're calling the prioritizers. And we had, just as part of this amazing lecture series that Dartmouth has been doing, we had Elbridge Colby up here, and some of you might have heard that conversation we had. And he's potentially national security advisor for Trump. I'm not sure what his position would be, but he'll probably be pretty high up. And he's sort of the voice of this prioritizer school, which says, hey, we have this great power competitor in Asia. We don't have the resources to handle both these continents, right? And so the implication is Europe has to take the lead in Europe. So that's just a general trend that's going on, that even if we had had a Harris administration, I think Europe would have been pressured by that administration, much more politely, I'm guessing, to do more for its own defense. And I'll just add one more thing, which is in 2016, the Europeans could say, what just happened, America? And maybe say, like, oh, there's the Russians went nuts on Facebook and scared the Americans, or, this was a fluke. I'm not sure how this happened, maybe tampering or whatever. We're not in fluke world anymore, right? This is now, I mean, there is a good, healthy part, there's a good, healthy view in American politics, which is becoming increasingly mainstream, that says Europe needs to do more to protect its own security. And the Europeans are seeing that view get a lot of traction in the United States. Again, I don't think this is the key issue on which voters went to the ballot box, but this is, again, with the rise of these views in the foreign policy establishment, I don't think Europe can ignore this anymore. I don't think Europe can say, oh, a second Trump term in which the whole map turned red, what a fluke, So I think the Europeans will be watching that and will, maybe to a degree they hadn't before, be more willing to kind of make the sacrifices that they need to make.
Well, thank you. The country is run by more than just the President of the United States, and there were elections across the country on Tuesday. I said earlier we did not expect that we would know the outcome of the presidential election. We still don't know the outcome of all of the House races, and so. As of right now, the Republicans have more seats, but there's a lot of races that have yet to be determined in California, many of which are likely to be Democratic, and there's at least a chance that the Democrats could take the House. And so, whether or not the Democrats take the House or not, how does divided government versus no divided government sort of impact what the president can do and sort of what the next at least the next 2 years are going to look like? Jason, if I could put you on the spot for that one, if you're willing to give that one a shot. Just sort of the difference between a Democratic House versus a Republican House.
Right. So yes, like you said, we still do not yet know. It's going to be close in either regard, probably. The first thing I would point to is just investigations. So the House tends to investigate. You saw a lot of that, certainly in the Obama years and then during the Biden years too. So I think that would be a major change in terms of how much scrutiny Trump administration decisions would face on that, depending on the policy control. Also then policy more generally, I think you're gonna, if the Republicans control all three branches, House, Senate, and then the three chambers anyway.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court is also very, I think, favorable toward the Trump administration. So anyway, unified control in that sense would probably also mean fewer policy compromises. I think you'd see more legislation than anything before. So all else equal, I think we're likely to see, regardless, just more action in Congress than we may have in a while. Some people may really like that direction, some people may not, but that's going to be the case. The Senate is probably the more important one in some ways because of the judicial appointments. If Supreme Court seat comes open, people were openly speculating this morning about whether or not some of the justices should step down in the next 10 weeks and possibly try to get a very quick appointment, but there's sort of skepticism about whether or not that would be possible. So I look for oversight differences, policy differences, the pace of policy output, and potentially, just interbranch workings and whatnot too. So other people might. Anna studies legislatures and caucuses and whatnot too. So maybe you have another take on this too.
Well, I think this was brought up when former Vice President Mike Pence was here too, of Trump's ambitions within his own bureaucracy, right, and his hopes to put more political allies within the bureaucracy. And I think, over time we've seen an expanded role of the executive. So regardless of what happens with the legislature, I think he will take the bull by the horns on his own to do a lot of executive orders and changes within the bureaucracy. And so even if he doesn't get the House, I think there's still a lot of independent action he'll be taking on his own.
Earlier, I want to refer to something, Jenny, that you said. I don't know if I have the quote exactly right, but you said something about the Russians going nuts on Facebook. And because we have,
See if you can keep up with the technical jargon.
it's like, did you learn that in graduate school? So Brendan, because we have you here, and I know that you study who's going nuts on Facebook. I'm wondering to what extent misinformation was a factor this time around, and maybe because it wasn't so close, maybe it did make a difference. I don't know, but you tell me, what did you see as we were heading up to Election Day?
Sure, I'll add a couple of points. The first is, heading into this election, everyone was very worried about AI misinformation. I just want to underscore that because it's, of course, disappeared. It played almost no role in this campaign. To the extent that it did, it was mostly these AI-generated memes you've probably seen, which are kind of used to kind of, please the partisan base, these kinds of ideas that people can now make little images of, Kamala Harris in communist clothes or whatever, right? Like you can now find those on social media. I don't think it really changed anything though. So I just want to draw our attention to that because it seemed so new and scary. People started to really panic. And I was worrying even at the time they would cause them to distrust legitimate news more. And I think the lack of any traction for the kinds of advanced fakes that people feared just really underscores how premature that kind of speculation was. That's one point I'll offer. When we talked about AI misinformation, I said the risk is precisely that we underestimate the importance of the boring misinformation, which is the kind coming from politicians who have tens of millions of supporters in the American public, one of whom tried to overthrow our election system and stay in power after the last election on the basis of an unprecedented campaign of misinformation, claiming that the election had been stolen. We didn't see that after the fact, but it shouldn't blind us to the risk that that same playbook will be used again and again. We could see the groundwork being laid for such an attack on the results of the election. It didn't end up being carried out, and you can read interesting stories where people are trying to resolve the cognitive dissonance, who really believe in this stuff, right? If Democrats control all the voting machines, why are they losing everywhere, right? There are a lot of people right now who are puzzling that one over. But so that has gone away, but I just want to draw our attention to it because it remains a profound threat to our democracy. And I'll just add, the other, I think, most important threat of the misinformation we saw was the misinformation suggesting illegal immigrants were responsible for a vast crime wave across America when all the data suggests that immigrants in general and unauthorized immigrants in particular commit crimes at a lower rate than Americans. That kind of misinformation can generate real harms offline, and it may be used to try to legitimize or motivate this mass deportation operation that's been discussed. So I think that's something that we should watch going forward.
We'll do one more question and then we'll turn to Q&A. And it's sort of related, Brendan, to something you said about Democrats losing elections all over, at least on Tuesday. And if you start to look at some of the results and you get more granular about the demographics, it does seem like President Trump won a lot of the different sort of demographic and geographic groups. And I remember at the Kellyanne Conway, Donna Brazile debate in this room a couple weeks ago, I was struck by what Kellyanne Conway said about one of the significances of Donald Trump was that he brought the working man to the Republican side. And I think you probably saw that on Tuesday, but you also saw other groups that were not typically Republicans in greater numbers, whether it was Hispanic or Black, and he got more, I think, of the female vote than was necessarily expected. So, to what extent are we seeing a realignment, and to what extent is Trump's lack of traditional Republican positions scrambling in a meaningful way that could last beyond him? To what extent is the electorate changing, do we think? Or is that just too soon to tell?
I'll just say that when we talk about the gender gap, for example, the gender gap performed about as it has for the last 10 years. Women as a broad category typically support the Democratic candidate by about 10 more points. Harris was around there. There was a little bit of a change in the gender gap in other racial categories, but not dramatically. I think that there was an over-expectation that women would cross-party to vote for Harris. That is not something that people do. And despite everyone's best hopes, Republicans voted for Republicans and Democrats voted for Democrats. So I just wanted to add that about the gender gap at least.
Interesting. All right, let's do some audience Q&A.
To your point at the end, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, the professor at the end. You were talking about how we didn't see the Trump misinformation around voting data, voting machines, et cetera, come to light because of the obvious reasons. But do you think the disinformation around immigrants and crime, crime in general, the economy being as bad as it is, do you think that a lot of the things that Trump did say that got amplified by Musk and Rogan, et cetera, impacted the outcome?
Well, I'd separate what people say are the issues that are most important to them and the reasons that they're voting, right? So Republicans tend to vote for Republicans and Democrats tend to vote for Democrats. And when you ask Democrats and Republicans why they're voting the way they are, they tend to reflect the issues that their campaigns, their candidates campaigned on, right? So to the extent that Donald Trump was talking about immigration, many of his voters were saying immigration was the most important issue to them, right? So in that sense, right, what he said clearly resonated with his supporters. It's less clear, though, that his immigration positions are why he did why there was this swing, which I think is more plausibly attributable to inflation. I'll add, though, there are some cases where that may not be true. For instance, Trump dramatically overperformed in border counties in Texas in a way that reporting suggests is actually driven by the situation there and the real-world consequences of border enforcement under Biden.
Nope, we got over here, right?
Hi, this is for Professor Mahoney, but also kind of everyone. You have been mentioning that people do not vote cross-party, like they stay consistent in their party lines. Trump got similar, not the same, but similar number of votes from the 2020 election. Harris got what I think is a dramatically lower number than Biden. Why do you think that is? Is there like a specific reason why people just didn't vote for her? Or is it a myriad of things?
I'm sorry, what was the last part?
Specific reason or myriad of things?
Oh, okay. As I spoke about last week to a group of alumni at homecoming, there's two ways to win campaigns. You get your voters to turn out, or you get other people's voters to stay home, right? And so it appears as though there were at least some number of Democratic voters that the campaign was counting on turning out that did not, right? I think there's a lot of explanation for that, but I just want to go back a little bit to what Brendan said as well, which is I think that what was offered by both candidates on both sides was not really necessarily policy-driven, but that there were a lot of appeals to voters across a lot of different fronts. And to your point about how people say they vote versus why they're actually voting, right? And so I think that the that Vice President Harris didn't see the turnout that she needed to have, and certainly not the numbers that President Biden had, right? And I don't, as we've seen, part of the criticism is that she didn't separate herself enough from Biden. And so if her policies and her story was similar to President Biden's, but she didn't get those numbers, then, what then are the differences between President Biden and Vice President Harris? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there's a disconnect between, as you were saying, what people say that they're voting for and about and what is actually going on.
Can I add one quick thing? Just one note on the number of votes. This has been going around a lot on social media. The count in the West takes forever and will bring a bunch of Democratic votes into the column, so that the kind of seeming fewer votes phenomenon that's happening is in part a function of the partial counts. So the national counts will look much more similar when the process is complete than they do now. It doesn't seem to have been a strictly turnout story. So I just wanted to flag that point.
But Trump also did really well among first-time voters. So I think just in that same way we were just talking about what Harris may not have done, you could flip it around and think about, there's a real bet that new voters would be brought into the system. And so Biden was plus 32 in 2020, and Trump was plus 13 among first-time voters. And so some of those might be young, old, but I see people being brought into the electoral system that we hadn't seen before. And there's a massive switch between those two candidates, those two races.
Hello. Thank you so much for this panel. I learned recently that immigration wasn't always a big Republican issue, and that they used to be very pro-immigration because it's good for business. And in that vein, I was just wondering, how likely is it that Trump is actually going to follow through on the immigration rhetoric, and how much of it is just presenting an image that Republicans like to hear? And just on incoherent policy issues, how much of it does he actually care about how these things affect business?
Who do you want to take this?
It's a good question.
I mean, if he follows through on this, businesses stand to lose a lot of the workforce, which will be inflationary, so there's a myriad of concerns. He's an atypical Republican, not your Wall Street kind of Republican, country club Republican, Main Street establishment sort of thing. So he's really, with the tariffs, with a whole bunch of economic policies, he's taken atypical Republican positions. And I think this labor one will really force some decisions about the business community versus really following through on the mass deportations.
I'm sure Elon Musk will work that all out with him in the end. I'm sure he'll take care of it.
So this is a question for anyone, but I think a statistic I saw after the election that really left an impression on me was that this year is the first year since World War II in which every governing party in a developed country lost vote share. So, you all spoke about inflation. I'm curious as to, how much you attribute the outcome of this election to sort of this, voting against the incumbent effect. And, theoretically, if we could strip out that effect, how much do you think this outcome is attributable to actual support for Donald Trump's message?
We are seeing a phenomenon kind of across the developed world of frustration or dissatisfaction with institutions and existing major parties, and that's created an opening for so-called anti-system parties around the world, right? And our political system is uniquely vulnerable to capture by them, being a two-party system. They've been buffered more in Europe, but that same kind of appeal has seemed to resonate there as well. I think there's something to that. One thing I might add to the inflation story, and we don't have empirical evidence for this, is really a kind of conjecture, but it's something to think about that I've seen some persuasive writing making this point. People express very little trust in the political system. They don't like government. Donald Trump forced Democrats into being the embodiment of defending the status quo and the institutions that Americans generally dislike. And that's a very uncomfortable position politically when so many people think things are on the wrong track and they're so distrustful of government. When Donald Trump is attacking institutions, the instinct people had was to defend them. But that just put them, I think, in a very politically tough position. So that might be one story about what's going on there beyond inflation.
Lots of questions, great.
Hi, so I want to ask about like abortion and women's rights. So like Trump could enact a federal abortion ban through like reinstating or putting power into like the Comstock Act, and Harris has like been like a candidate for like protecting like women's like rights, and even though like abortion does very well in states where it's like on the ballots, like the Trump's like federal abortion ban could like eliminate all of that. So like how does that work for voters who are pro-abortion rights but like also pro-Trump? And my second question is that if Trump does enact a federal abortion ban, like is there anything that we can do about that?
Well, he promised he wasn't going to, so I think we should just take him at his word. This is another factor about this election that I think there was a lot of expectation that people would be voting on this single issue. This was something that Hillary Clinton tried to impress upon voters in 2016, that abortion was on the ballot, in that the next president was going to name these Supreme Court justices, and that didn't result in the groundswell that advocates sometimes hope for. And so I think it's very possible with a unified Republican government that there would be attempts for a federal ban on abortion. Although we saw on Tuesday in several states reaffirming abortion access, and even in some unlikely places. And so I think this is gets a little bit back to what Brendan was saying, is that frequently voters say they want one thing and then vote in an alternative way. And there's also a disconnect sometimes between voters and the elites. So I have this example from living in Louisiana for a really long time. Like polls in Louisiana overwhelmingly show that like 75% of the population wants an increase in minimum wage, 75% want equal pay, but their elected officials don't. And so regardless of the disconnect between that public opinion and elites, it's not always necessarily reflected in policy.
I have a question about tariffs and what Trump has said about levying tariffs on, imports from other countries. And I guess my couple of questions are: one, who gets to bear the final cost of these retail goods almost? And two, what could that mean for relationships with other countries?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, right.
Yes, so Trump speaks very fondly of tariffs. He says they're beautiful things. He's a big fan. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a tax on products that are coming into the United States. And so that obviously, if you impose a tax, that raises the cost of the product. And so that's inflationary, right? I mean, that raises prices. And if you're doing it across like 100% everything coming from China, for example, then that's a lot of stuff. And so, now we're getting back to take him seriously, literally, and remember all those conversations. I would be surprised if someone who, I think many people voted for him based on kind of pocketbook issues. I mean, we don't know why or whatever. Maybe they were just Republicans, but I think many people were deeply concerned about high prices that we've experienced in the last several years under Biden's rule, and so they were voting for change from that, right? And Harris, being in power during that time, could not credibly convince people that she was going to be different, right? So I think that's just a fundamental problem. And so, so we have a candidate who has been elected saying, I will relieve this problem, right? I will alleviate this burden on you, American workers. And so to impose highly inflationary moves, just like we were talking about with immigration.
That's a much nicer way than I said it.
So to impose that kind of a burden on workers, that doesn't strike me as being a smart move. But But we do know he's a fan of tariffs. He's said so. He has put tariffs on several different Chinese products in his first term, and many of those remained under Biden. And so I think the broader signal of this, again, there's kind of a signaling maybe that's going on rather than a literal, this is my policy. I think the signal is to say, he's staking out a platform that says the terms of trade between the United States and China are deeply unfair to American firms, to American workers. I'm committed to addressing that. And so one way in which you might do that is through tariffs, but again, that's going to come with some major hits to the economy in the forms of rising prices. There are other instruments that you might use. So you could use subsidies targeting specific firms and helping them reduce their prices and make their goods more competitive. But now that gets into some really interesting issues, because now the American firms are more competitive relative to their, say, European or Japanese or South Korean competitors, and so those allies are really upset, as they have been under the Biden administration, who have been heavily subsidizing green energy, right? So somebody's always going to be upset here if you're using any of these different mechanisms, but the different mechanisms will have differing effects on the economy. And so I'm not sure which instrument a Trump administration will use here, but I think what he's signaling to us, what he's telling us is, again, we're going to have pretty competitive economic relations with China, and the administration is going to be in the business of putting a lot of pressure on China to change the terms of this trade relationship.
So I want to talk about the culture war. The GOP spent $215 million this cycle attacking Harris for her position on trans issues. And so, her share of female voters decreased, Trump's share increased. Is this a sign that the Democrats are wrong in the culture war, at least on this one issue? And is this evidence that maybe they should change for the next cycle?
Okay, I'll take it. And there's a very good piece in the Wall Street Journal today about the insiders in the Trump campaign, Chris Savita, some people who are doing this. They identified this issue in a focus group. It sort of came on the scene early 2020s, but then they identified that the voters just really resonating with this, talking about bathroom bans or boys playing on women's teams or boys playing on girls' teams. So. They put a lot of money behind it, as you noted. So I think I think for them it's easier sometimes to talk about that issue, and they kind of get the people who might also care about some of the other aligned issues, maybe abortion. I've heard that mentioned as well. So I do think that Americans by and large, especially on certain cultural issues, were sort of resonating more with the way that the Republicans were signaling the messages on here. So I don't know if you all saw that too in the returns and whatnot, but.
I don't know if we know the penalty. I think we're having one of the debates that often happens where people are weighing their commitments to vulnerable groups against the political costs of particular positions associated with those. And those are very challenging issues for political parties. Obviously, trans folks are a really vulnerable group. It is also the case that it is a wedge issue that is not working to the Democrats' benefit. I don't think it's the reason Harris lost, but it's part of a bundle of issues that we'll be seeing in the data. If people think the Democrats are too far to the left on these kinds of issues, that's a kind of claim people have made. I don't think we have the data to know the answer yet, but it is a very active debate, I think, within the Democratic Party right now.
We've got time for one more question, and looks like you will be it.
Awesome. Hi, so this is a New Hampshire specific question. I hadn't been really following the governor's race, but after seeing Harris poll so high in New Hampshire, I was kind of surprised that Ayotte won so quickly. I was wondering, was this an expected outcome, and how does lack of support for Trump in New Hampshire, what does that tell us about state politics for the next 4 years?
Yeah. So this was, I said when our first poll came out in October that this was one of the most worrisome findings, is that the pattern really was advantaging Republicans statewide in New Hampshire, and it was odd to see a result that was not consistent with that. And you see this in New England especially, but you also see it other areas. You see people having a preference for, here, Democrats, federal offices, but Republicans for the statewide offices. So Sununu had just won 4 elections, but yet we had a very blue delegation. So that sort of taste is certainly out there in New Hampshire. And I was, if there was one race that I was kind of worried about our overall call on, that was the one. And so you definitely saw that here. You see it actually the other way around too. Well, I guess similarly in Vermont. So, Phil Scott won 70% of the vote. Huge victory there, even when Bernie Sanders is getting reelected, even when Democrats are sweeping a lot of the other areas. Although I should say, it might not, to continue with the federal versus state analogies or the exploration here, both of those states, Republicans made gains in both those state legislatures, even though they're democratically controlled. Democrats in Vermont lost their supermajorities in both chambers. They still have a healthy majority, and similarly, Republicans made inroads in New Hampshire too. So there are lots of very interesting dynamics that you see playing out with preferences over different levels of government, and do they want one party in control or the other. I think you even saw this, to go back to the abortion question just for a moment, 7 of 10 states passed their abortion referendums, but Trump is still carrying a lot of those states. And so voters are showing an amazing degree of being able to, look at the various issues and make decisions in different categories that I found quite remarkable. And we've seen it here in New Hampshire.
Again, that's a nicer way than I said it.
Yeah. More charitable to the voters. Faith and democracy.
Faith and democracy. That's a nice way to end. So thank you all for coming out tonight. And thank you for spending your Friday evening with us before you head into the weekend. Thank you.
Thanks.